Welcome to the PIDE webinar. As you know, we keep trying to find as many people as we can, both locally as well as internationally, to talk about all subjects of interest to us as Pakistanis. We would like to learn about all aspects of Pakistan's policy and try and be as cognizant of what's happening in the world as possible. तो इसी वजह से जो PID webinars हैं, they are actually like, how should I say, they're like a university. So I hope people are watching these and learning from them. Today we have Dr. Hussain Nadim. Hussain Nadim is a young man who has done a PhD thesis, which is very interesting, which has come out in the form of a book. Hussain has worked with Ahsan Iqbal in the Planning Commission. Hussain has completed his PhD from Australia. And Hussain has also been Executive Director of Islamabad Policy Research Institute, where he's done many interesting changes, brought in digital into that stodgy think tank. And Hussain is now on his way to join a Google lab in the Silicon Valley. So all the best wishes to Hussain. But let's talk about Hussain's book, Aid, Politics and the War of Narratives in the US-Pakistan Relations. We are a beggar nation. We love to beg. And he looked at the Kerry Lugar bill. I remember when I was in the Planning Commission, Kerry Lugar was the most exciting thing that happened anywhere. We were all agog. Kerry Lugar was the game changer. Kerry Lugar would make us go. Kerry Lugar would do. That's what we used to say. Now the same thing is being said of CPEC. So, I mean, soon we'll be talking about Qatar's game changer and Dubai's game changer. I don't know where we'll go next. I think probably Benin and Botswana will be giving us game changers, because we will not change our own game. We'll only wait for others to come and change our game. So maybe Hussain will tell us how Kerry Lugar changed our game and whether we got any money from Kerry Lugar or not. So with that introduction, over to Hussain. Hussain Nadim, please take off.
Thank you, Dr. Nadim. I think you've given the crux of most of my research work in one-liner regarding the expectation of foreign-led development and foreign-led capacity building, foreign-led social development in Pakistan. But I will go a little bit more deeper into disentangling and demystifying the exact politics, the narratives, and the exact data around it, because I think this is one of the very most important subjects. But first, I would like to thank Dr. Nadim Haq and PIDE for inviting me over and also hosting the first book launch of my recent book on US-Pakistan relations and aid politics as well. So first of all, thank you. And second, I would like to just begin. I want to break this conversation down into parts to start off by basically telling you exactly what led to the idea of the book. It took me almost 7 years. It's part of my PhD research. And from the research part, it took me 4 more years to edit the book into edit the thesis into a book form, which is very different from actually the PhD thesis itself. It actually started with this whole notion I wanted to explore around billions and billions of dollars of aid. What has happened was that every other US president that would walk into the Oval Office would start off relations with Pakistan by suggesting that we've given you billions and billions of dollars without getting bang for the buck. I wanted to explore what exactly was the truth behind this aid, because there was so much talk about aid in Pakistan, and yet when you would go around Pakistan, the aid was not felt. And this is one of the very most important part, because the conversation and the exaggerated talk around the aid and the reality of aid is so different that I wanted to figure out what exactly was going on behind the curtains of the aid. I had a chance to work at the Planning Commission, which was dealing a lot with the donor organizations, which in another way wanted me to explore the subject in more detail from an academic perspective. So the idea came about that, and there were a lot of interesting insights that I developed. I'll talk about those insights in a little bit, but I'll just give you what my thesis supervisor once told me was that if you can't describe your any idea or a book or a thesis in under 1 minute, that means you're not clear. So I'm just going to begin by laying out what exactly the book is about. I'll give you a little bit about semantics of the book, and then we can go on the key takeaways. Basically, this book explores the politics and narratives around foreign aid in the context of US-Pakistan relations. I've taken the case study of US-Pakistan. It deploys a post-colonial framework. So I'm using the post-colonial framework and the extensive data sets from the interviews and the USA data sets, the USAIG reports. I went in a lot of detail on those data sets that I had to present my case. The core argument of this book is exactly simple. One, and I think Dr. Nadim will really enjoy this. The core argument is that foreign aid is political. All foreign aid is political, and it serves the short-term interest of the donors over the long-term interests of the recipients. And I want to repeat this again. It serves the short-term political security interest of the donor organizations and the donor countries over the long-term development interest of the recipient countries. I've done the case study of Pakistan, which is published, but I've also done other case studies of Egypt, similar countries around the world, and the pattern is rather similar. Second, foreign aid is also insensitive, and in most cases, very deeply neo-colonial in its configuration. What do I mean by that? What I'm saying is that foreign aid is racist in its absolute neglect of the local voices or concerns. So the recipients of the aids are actually not the end consumers of the aid, which is why the whole discrepancy of so much talk around aid, and yet the money does not get translated on ground. So the aid, and I'll talk a little bit about the racism part, because this is very important for us to understand how aid actually reinforces racial binaries and that global north and south divide as well. Lastly, what the book essentially argues is that the foreign aid unleashes a vicious politics in the recipient countries by reinforcing the status quo powers and the corrupt elite at the expense of the democracy and the rights regime. So it's essentially a paradox where the countries that are trying to, supposedly the Western bloc that is trying to reinforce the rights regime or democracy, essentially, if you look at the 70 years of data in Pakistan, the aid has benefited a particular class of elite in the country. And I will tell you how it has benefited. The benefit is not in terms of the monetary value that they were eating up the aid. That was also a large portion of that has gone there, but much more that the aid, foreign aid, has allowed the local power elite to retain its monopoly on power and resources. And I'll tell you, the book actually goes in a lot of detail in how that has happened. So these are some of the main arguments that the foreign aid is political, it is insensitive, and it allows a vicious politics to happen. Whenever you take money from abroad, it triggers a domestic political confrontation and a struggle. Details about the book. So it has 3 sections and 8 chapters, including the introduction and conclusion. The first section deals with the framework for me, which is the most important part. So what I've done is that I've taken the post-colonial framework, which I think is perhaps the most beautiful framework to lay down when you look at the global North-South relations, the US-Pakistan relations, and specifically when the donor and the recipient relations are in question. You look at the post-colonial framework and you realize how the wording, the framing of the discourses, and how the aid has been communicated is actually very deeply rotten from its design to its core and its monitoring and evaluation to the whole process. Is extremely a rotten process. The second section deals with the aid and the impact on the national security policies, how aid has essentially been part of what the Secretary Hillary Clinton talked about. We want to change Pakistan's behavior, and this was the repeated word being used by the Obama administration, that we want to change Pakistan's behavior, as somehow Pakistan was a spoiled child in the world where they were trying to influence or change the behavior. The third section deals with the local politics, which is how foreign aid actually triggers a sort of confrontation between the local power elite, the civilian political establishment, and the security establishment, which continue to call each other as traitors, as foreign funded, and all of that. So aid is not as benign as we think. And you will find it most fascinating how a very small amount, which I'm going to prove right now, which I've actually proved in my research, how much actually aid has been communicated, and that's the scoop. I want to keep it till the end. इतनी जो aid के बारे में बात हुई है, eventually how much aid has actually gotten on the ground, and for that I had to put a lot of effort in looking, scanning, and going into those nitty-gritties of USAID, because the USAID data sets are very technical in terms of how they manipulate the language. The technicalities is where the entire devil is. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Uh, 4 layers of this book. If you want to talk to me about what are the key takeaways, there are 4 layers of this book. First, that speaks about the foreign aid and the nuances between the donor and aid relations. Second is the US-Pakistan relations and the backdrop of the foreign aid during the time of Afghanistan war. So I use that as a case study to prove the larger point that all aid is political and aid can never be a net positive for the recipient country. Third, the civil military tussle in Pakistan, and that is part of my 7th chapter, which I think is fascinating because I realized that so much of our politics is actually linked with what is happening around the world and their priorities. Fourth, at the theoretical and conceptual level, I think one of the interesting things I was able to understand was how do you use post-colonialism, the post-colonial theory, to disentangle the deeply racist and Western-centric notion of foreign affairs, domestic politics, and aid. And much of my book is essentially being used, is using that framework. So starting with the first one, the book explains the politics of aid between the donor and recipient countries, between global north and south, under the security network, security development nexus as a framework for international development. Now, this is something very, very interesting because if you look at what has happened during the Cold War, and specifically after the end of the Cold War, there is this framing of the international development that has been done under the security development nexus, mostly led by the United Nations and the World Bank, which started talking about this new security development nexus, where the idea was that security and development go hand in hand, that without security there is no development, and without development there is no security. Famously said by Kofi Annan in 1994 in the UN Development Report, that there cannot be any security without development. But the key question over here is, whose security are we talking about and whose development? Back in the 90s, what happened was that when the Cold War ended, there was new sort of wars. It was not between the states; it was within the state. The crisis in Rwanda, the crisis in Somalia, and other places where the civil war started happening after the whole colonization and the period ended. That the UN wanted to figure out a way, how do you stabilize? So under the stabilization discourse, this new words emerged: the stabilization, the fragile states, the failed states, and all of that. To actually counter that, these organizations, the multilateral, the Americans and the British, they come up with this whole idea about the nexus, that without security and that there is no development, and vice versa. But there is a big problem attached to it, because despite of that benign idea of security and development, underneath it was actually happening was the securitization and even militarization of it. In terms of Pakistan, it got even more toxic, where you had donor organizations, including Save the Children, using development agenda as a way to collect intelligence information and run hardcore intelligence operations, which jeopardized the whole hepatitis campaign, the polio campaign. So the securitization and even militarization of aid was a big problem. So this whole security development nexus, I would want to encourage, I don't want to go into the detail, I would encourage the development economists and other students over here to actually go and explore how this whole myth around that you need, for development you need security and security needs development, has really brought in a political agenda of the global past to go into the developing countries for the sake of development and yet pursue politics and the geostrategic issues over there. What really happened under this was that throughout this period of the 90s, and since we saw in 2001, under these so many projects, winning hearts and minds, stabilization projects led by the US, UK, reconstruction projects, the short-term security interests of the donors were always trumping the long-term development interest. You look at Afghanistan, you look at Iraq, you look at Pakistan, including Pakistan, you will realize that much of the aid was being led partly and mostly through the through Pentagon instead of the State Department. And there are plenty of evidences to provide you that, including the US AIG report, which essentially suggested that the US, the Kerry-Lugar-Berman Act failed in Pakistan, part and parcel because the political interest of the State Department superseded the long-term development interest of US aid. So even within the inter-agency, there was so much rivalry that the friction of those the rivalries in Washington were having a direct impact on ground in Pakistan, where State Department the CIA station chief, and all of these people were essentially on each other's throat on whose agenda will follow first. And naturally, in that, the winner was always the security and the military establishment instead of the development establishment, because that takes time and all. But as I've had several conversations, Dr. Nadim, about it, one of the interesting most impact about this is not just the securitization and the militarization. I mean, I can talk at length, write 5 more books on that subject, but here is where the soft issue is, which I think is even more problematic, that under the security development nexus and the Kerry-Lugar-Berman, the tragedy is that the donor have been able to define the priorities of the country. What do I mean by that? Priorities. By priorities, I essentially mean who sets the research agenda of the universities, who sets the research agenda of the think tanks, who sets the agenda of the central governments. Unfortunately, when you're taking the money from abroad, one of the most important things that happened in Pakistan was that the donors had the leverage to define the priorities of the country. And that is, I mean, Dr. Nadim has worked with the donors and he understands how this works. So if they're providing you $1 million grant, that grant is specifically, for instance, let's say ABC, which is important for the donor organizations, but which is completely irrelevant to the recipient countries, or maybe 5th, 6th down in the priority. But when the funding is entirely flowing into the direction which is of the interest of the donor organizations, or even the regions which are of interest to the donor organizations, then what is the net result is that the regions, the priorities, the issues, the themes that are of immediate interest to the local people are not being catered to, because the fundings of the donors are being directed in that way. Now, one would argue that you have the government funds to actually put in place over there. So why are the government funds not being deployed for your own development work, and why the donor is setting the agenda? It is because it's not just the money that is coming in. What is happening underneath is that your intelligentsia and your intellectual elite that is supposed to write the columns, write the reports, or run the think tanks, when the think tanks and the public intellectuals start taking money from the donor organizations, I'm not saying that there is some corruption or anything. Don't take it wrong. What I'm suggesting is that when your public intellectuals start taking the money from abroad or the donor organizations, the agenda and by and large is set by the donor organizations. Now, when the priorities in the agenda is set by them, the importance and the significance of the issues of the local people are not very much there. And this is one of the things that Sayyid Hussain Nadim from George Washington University talked about in our recent webinar at IPRI, which was essentially that Pakistan's fundamental problem is that we have fifth-rate intellectuals. I'm quoting his words, that fifth-rate intellectuals in Pakistan are more connected to the rights causes and the issues of the US and New York than they're connected with their local population and the local issues. So what's happening to the local farmers and what's happening to the local ground, there is less debate on that. And there are the public intellectuals and the elite intellectual class is more concerned about the Black Lives Movement and et cetera, happening in the New York City, because for them, that English-speaking world and the donor-led agenda allows them to be part of the global conversation, which is the new norm, if you want to pitch yourself as a global expert. So these are some of the problems from the militarization to the securitization part, which I detailed in my book. But more importantly, the part where our intellectual elite is not serving the interest of the local population or the conversations. Instead, they've become pegged to the global conversation where the donors are defining the agenda, which may be completely divorced from Pakistan's reality. And I think this is one of the things that has happened, that Pakistan's reality is so divorced from our public intellectuals, and the conversations are so divorced from our actual reality, that the reality only starts becoming real when we are hit by a crisis. For instance, right now, how many experts on climate we have, how many experts on floods and the water management we have? Turns out that it took a flood of the catastrophic nature that we have right now, with 70% of Pakistan underwater, to now everyone becoming an expert on flood management and water management and climate expert on Twitter. But in reality, how many actually, for the 70 years, we are one of the most vulnerable countries to climate, and we have serious issues related to the climate management. Yet, what we see is that in 70 years, we've not been able to produce even a handful of climate experts till the crisis hit. So why is that the case? Because we are so diverse from the local issues that we are constantly talking about, and I'm going to blame mostly the intellectual elite class for its complete fascination with the global issues and ignoring the local ones. Part of the reason is where the money is flowing. Second thing which is important in the book, the second layer of the book, is something that I'm not going to go into much detail, but it looks at the case study of US-Pakistan relations in the backdrop of Afghanistan war. Since I used KLB Act, I talked much about the narrative of the billions and billions of dollars, so I'm going to focus much on that. And I'm going to also talk about the breakdown of aid since 2001. But I'm also going to argue something else. I don't want to blame the donors entirely. There is a big problem happening on ground here in Pakistan, how the ruling elite of this country has run and governed or misgoverned this country for the last 70 years. So let's start with the narrative of billions and billions of dollars aid. Here is an issue on that, and that is very interesting. And I'll give the comparison with Ukraine right now. Since 2001, Pakistan has received around about $33.4 billion in US assistance. Interestingly, out of this 33 billion, $14 billion is actually not the aid. It is the CSF, the Coalition Support Fund, which is Pakistan's own money, which has been reimbursed. So let's pull that out because they continue to count billions and billions and 34 CSF in that as well. In actual essence, in the last 20 years, Pakistan has received around $8 billion in security assistance, security and military assistance, and $11 billion in economic assistance since 2002. That is around about $1 billion a year. Okay, so $1 billion is not a bad amount. We were fighting a US war. One would imagine that this is not a bad amount, but turns out there is a bigger problem. About 25% to 30% of this supposedly $19 billion that Pakistan has received has gone into the administrative costs. So the money never actually came to Pakistan. It went right away from the administration cost, never came to Pakistan, the overheads and all of that. So 25% take out that. So let's say if we're doing the ballpark figure, $20 billion Pakistan has received, $1 billion a year. From $1 billion to $50 million, it never came to Pakistan. It has nothing to do with Pakistan. It's an overhead cost. But there is a problem. Rest of the $750 million is again the money that the dollar never saw the day in Pakistan, because the money was directly spent, specifically under the Kerry-Lugar government. Somehow the government allowed the Americans to essentially give the money directly to their own contractors. So the government of Pakistan in many cases did not even know who was a registered contractor, who was not, who the money was going, where the money was going, which is why one of the reasons we see that there was a ballooning of the whole security intelligence setup in Pakistan and how things were running wild in this country with Raymond Davis, OBL events. There is a reason why that happened, and the reason was Kerry-Lugar-Berman Act. So $750 million out of that, the ballpark figure where we have figured out that the contractors' money was again about 40% of that. So the contractors took away 40% of the leftover 750, which essentially comes down to about $300 million. What you're left with in Pakistan is about $400 million a year to fight the battle in Afghanistan and the war on terror. The reparation costs, the cost that Pakistan has essentially paid for that is upwards of $1 trillion. I don't agree with the assessments made by the Pakistani government that we have essentially suffered about $120 billion in infrastructure depreciation and et cetera. I think the cost is way upwards of a 1 trillion, because when we look at the cities, Miran Shah, Mir Ali, Dar Adam Khel, much of the Waziristan, it has been completely razed to the ground. If you look at the psychological cost, if you look at the economic cost, it is upwards of $5 to $10 trillion if I have to give in the last 20 years. But let's say we go with the figures of the $120 billion suggested by the government. The aid to Pakistan become essentially peanuts. So what is happening over here? Here is the thing. Under the US foreign policy in the Kerry-Lugar-Berman Act, one of the things that I've written in my book is that it is the promise of aid which is more powerful than the aid on ground actually. So for the Kerry-Lugar-Berman, the promise was that we will give you $1.5 billion every year for 5 years, and then we will renew the program for the next 5 years. So Kerry-Lugar-Berman was supposed to go from 2010 to 2020. Guess what happened? It stopped in 2013. Since 2013, we have not received a penny under the Kerry-Lugar-Berman because the priorities of the US had already changed. They achieved what they wanted to achieve. The priorities had changed, and the mismanagement of the program never really actually materialized on ground because you were not able to even provide the level of funding you promised. So the promise was we will provide you 1.5 billion. The local capacity of the US aid was only to spend about $250 million. There was only 1 year in 2011 where the US aid was able to spend about $1 billion plus dollars. But if you look at the next few years, even the promise of aid was not met. So what we received in Pakistan in the Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill, because I used KLB as a case study in a chromosome to look at the larger US aid, as I mentioned earlier, the aid is political. And when I say political, it is there to allow Americans or any foreign developer country or the donor the leverage over the local population, over the local policy leaders. What happens is that in an aid-starved country, in a constantly politically pressed country, you tell the Pakistanis that, look, we're going to give you $1.5 billion and $7 billion in 5 years. It allows something else to happen. It is not that the money is going to come or somehow the economy is going to improve. It is doing something else. And that something is that it is endorsing and providing legitimacy to the rulers and the ruling elite of that country, because it is a foreign money, and the foreign legitimacy that they require, the local political elite requires against this, it's in local politics, to be able to substantiate themselves as the leaders who have the right to rule in the country. I can go in much detail about that, but I know that the censorship is too much in the country right now, so I would rather not do that. But I do hope you get the point on how the aid itself has very little to do with the development of the people, which it supposedly on paper it's supposed to be. It is for two reasons. One, it serves the political interests and the security interests of the donors. But at the same time, my book argued that it is not all about the donors. What it does serve is actually the interests of the local elite that is trying to get legitimacy in an otherwise political domain where they have very little legitimacy. So if you look at what happens in the discourse in Pakistan, the whole conversation around Imran Khan not getting a call from Biden, the whole conversation that IMF is not giving funding to Shehbaz Sharif, our political elite has for a very long time tried to pitch themselves as the rightful and the Western, the people who can serve the Western interest abroad, because they've played on the vulnerabilities. And I don't want to go into much details about that, but if you read my book, I've written in much detail about how the ruling elite in this country has essentially used Pakistan's vulnerabilities, be it terrorism, be it poverty, and gone around the world pitching themselves and Pakistan in a very negative light from a vulnerability angle, anxiety inducing angle to the rest of the world. And look, our people, they're extremists, Islamists, completely cuckoo in head, and they're poor as well, and the economy is failing. If you don't support us, next, remember 1979 Tehran Revolution, Iranian Revolution. So Iranian Revolution is something that the Americans have been trying to avoid for a very, very long time in Pakistan, because the embedded fear is that somehow Pakistan is on the verge of a collapse, and there is a militia over here that will take over the nuclear weapons. And also, you've used the nuclear weapons, you've used your poverty, you use your entire issues related to extremism, which were frankly not that much, but you inflated them and presented them to abroad in hopes that you will get the credibility, the stability, and the foreign aid. And here is something else that I want to talk about in the context. It might probably be a little bit more unfortunate to talk about it. We're going through the worst crisis in Pakistan at the moment with floods. Now, I asked this one question. I worked in the public sector as well. Every year there are floods, every single year. Yes, this time the rain was twice as much, 3 times as much, but it's not the divine intervention which has resulted in the catastrophe. Yes, the rain was much, it led to catastrophe, but the whole propulsion and the exponential disaster is less to do with the rainfall and more to do with the mismanagement on the governance system. So we've not been able to even, वो pavements होती हैं आपकी डैम्स के साइड पे और नहरों के साइड पे, वो आपने 70 साल से पक्की नहीं की, आपने कच्ची रखी हुई है. सिंध के अंदर अगर आप क्रॉस कर रहे हो, लॉट ऑफ पीपल माइट बी अवेयर ऑफ दैट, जो सिंध से हैं, वहां पे जो आपकी नहरें चल रही हैं, जो आपकी बीच में से ट्रिब्यूटरीज निकल रही हैं, आपने उनको एलिवेट किया हुआ 10-10 फुट. वो होता ये आपकी एलिवेशन की वजह से, क्योंकि आपने ट्रिब्यूटरीज में उनको पानी भेजना है। एलिवेशन होता है जब हर साल थोड़ी सी जरा ज्यादा आपकी रेनफॉल होती है, अदरवाइज होती नहीं। जब होती है तो वो एलिवेशन की वजह से आपकी जो है वो सारे फ्लड हो जाते हैं, पूरी विलेजेस। ये एक फैक्ट है जो कि कोई भी सिंध का बंदा आपको बता सकता है, कोई भी डीसी रहा हो, आई विल टेल यू दैट yes, the rainfall was much, but your own policies, your own mismanagement and lack of cohesion was also the result of why this happened. But here is a problem, that since the flood has happened, the politics has started on the floods. Now you're going around pitching to the global community that, look, the floods have happened, please forgive our loans, please give us more money. And then you're vying for credibility, you're vying for other things. What is happening again is our ruling elite using floods, an unfortunate event, to again run a politics to tell the global community that, look, the floods have happened, the country is under, we have extremists on the head, the politics has gone completely cuckoo, the country will collapse, there will be extremists, then there will be nuclear weapons, the whole cycle starts in. And then you have the foreign powers becoming more interested in Pakistan and then providing support and all. Floods is not the only thing. My bigger problem is that something worse is happening with the governance sort, and much of that I've mentioned in the book as well, is that part of the vulnerabilities that we've been playing, we don't know what our assets are and what our vulnerabilities are. Last 10 years, constantly, I've been hearing one thing in every global conversations with the policymakers and through the communication, that we have a youth bulge. Okay, sure. So youth bulge is a great idea because countries around the world are trying, promoting people. I mean, in Australia, they give you $6,000 if you have a baby, and they're literally begging people to have more babies because they're undergoing minus population. So is the case with Canada and other European countries. In Pakistan, we have the largest youth at the moment. 60% of the countries under the age of 30. Yes, not entirely talented, semi-talented and all, but the very fact that we have young people itself is an asset. How has that asset been pitched over the last decade? Ticking time bomb. That is what we're calling the youth, a ticking time bomb. Every report, every UN, every World Bank, every report that we've been published, and our speakers and our intellectual elite, our policymakers, they go around the world, they give in the talks that, oh, youth is such a problem, it's a ticking time bomb. When you frame the youth as a time bomb, it is the time bomb they will be. And you look at the policies of the government of what they have done for the youth so far the supposed time bomb, nothing. The same way nothing was done on the floods. If the same way nothing is being done on the youth part as well. Why? Because for both the flood and for the ticking time bomb and for the apparently the so-called extremist radicals and all, your policy was to keep them under a particular way, to use them as narratives, the vulnerability narratives, to sell to the global community that, look, we are sitting on a landmine, and if you will not help us, we are doomed. And so the foreign countries would actually be panic induced by our speakers that who would go and travel to Washington, D.C., give lectures around State Department and other places and telling them that how much of a mess Pakistan is. And if you don't help us, if you don't engage with us, we are doomed. Instead of developing your own capacity, instead of developing your own management system, instead of utilizing your own youth, you have on purpose, and I say this on record, it's not by accident. It is not that somehow there was incompetence. It is by design. It is by a sheer agenda that you have kept these vulnerabilities as vulnerabilities, because these vulnerabilities allow you a stake in the global competition and a conversation. So every time the flood happens, there are a very few people, the political class and the ruling elite, that stand to benefit in terms of the global credibility, in terms of its recognition, and in terms of global engagement, which is unfortunately the disastrous thing that is happening right now if you look at the flood as well. So sorry for diverging a little bit on a different side, but back to the US foreign assistance to Pakistan. In 20 years, Pakistan has received 33 supposedly building $1 billion, which essentially is 19 billion, but which comes down to really $5 billion a year. If you have to ask me how much money came to Pakistan in 20 years, not more than 5 billion. Now compare that, because comparisons are always a good idea. And I'll tell you why I say that aid is politics. And the second part was that aid is racist. In last 7 months of the Ukraine war, how much money has flown into Ukraine? A total promise commitment of $100 billion by Western countries. The US alone has provided $54 billion to Ukraine, of which $35 billion is the military aid and $19 million in economic aid. In 6 months, I want to repeat this, in 6 months, $54 billion. Military aid, which is $35 billion, economic aid is $19 billion. And the total sum for Pakistan in 20 years, most unbelievable war, was a total of $19 billion, of which only about $5 billion came. So the whole narrative around we have provided Pakistan with billions and billions and billions of dollars and didn't get anything in result, whereas Pakistan contributed the most, upwards of $1 trillion services we provided to the Americans, and we got the worst bargain. Do I blame the Americans or the Westerns? No. Do I blame our bargainers? Absolutely yes, because it was their job to do the right math, the right calculation, and to be able to do the right bargain. They never did, because again, nobody probably expected that the war was go on for so long. But the difference between how much money has been given to Pakistan in 20 years and how much money has been given to Ukraine in 6 months, which is 5 to 6 times more than Pakistan, is because Ukraine is in Europe, and it now serves the strategic interests of the donor countries. So hence the whole idea. I want to just conclude my conversation on this one point, that the last point which I made is related to the discrepancy. And this is something that you will only figure out if you understand the post-colonial framing, the post-colonization, and how the global North and South is still divided, how the colonial power, the post-colonial powers is still operating in a very colonial way. And the colonization is not only about the monopoly on resources, it is also much more on the monopoly of knowledge production, monopoly on ideas, and the influence on the intellectual elite. Unfortunately, what we have in Pakistan right now is not a crisis, an economic crisis. What we have in Pakistan is not a security crisis. What we have in Pakistan right now is an intellectual crisis. And Dr. Nadimul Haq often talks about this in much detail. We don't have the public intellectual who can even recognize what our own problems are, because we have public intellectuals who are coming from private schools, KGSs, HSNs, going to universities, Cambridge, Oxford, slums, and etc. From one bubble to another bubble to a foreign bubble, coming back and sitting in a bubble more connected to the bubble abroad than to the local reality over here. The net result of that is extremely dangerous. The net result of that has happened in terms of what we are seeing in the flood crisis. My bigger fear from the flood crisis is actually the crisis that is going to develop with the youth, by calling them the ticking time bomb. And then for how the ruling political elite use the vulnerabilities of the country, pitching them as somehow on the brink, the country is on a brink, and then asking the question on why there is no foreign aid to Pakistan. I'll end with one more, that in the same post-colonial framing, and I'll give you one example to end this. In 2007 and 8, 6 and 7 actually, Pakistan was growing at the rate of about 5.8 to 6%. The 7 and 8, 8 and 9 saw Pakistan's collapse to about 1.2%. A lot of people say that the General Musharraf era went and the whole democratic regime came in, hence the difference and all. It's actually not true. It was something else, completely something else, in which you will recognize what the politics of aid is actually. Under the Kerry Lugar-Berman, and before that, the conversation in the US Congress has already started. They were clubbing Pakistan under the AFPAC discourse. So Pakistan was part of the South Asia, which is growing at about 6.5% annually on the growth rate. And somehow or the other, under the President Obama, when the Democrats changed in Congress in 2007 and Obama came, Pakistan was moved away from, which I call geopolitical cartography. We were moved away from South Asia and put in the club of AFPAC. Now, when you place a country, same country, and at a discursive and the narrative level as part of Afghanistan bloc, what happened? Standard & Poor's, Moody's ratings completely collapsed. The travel advisory on Pakistan went up. Net result was that the FDI reduced, the economic prosperity reduced, because now what is happening in Afghanistan is directly linked to Afghanistan and vice versa. So you shifted Pakistan, and that shift away from South Asia to AFPAC is one of the most ugliest thing that has been done by the donor agencies, to fixate Pakistan with Afghanistan. And the net result was that we had sporting events getting cancelled in Pakistan, no team wanted to visit here, etc., 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 with investment and everything. Sometimes these are little things, how the donor organizations, because when you take money, remember one thing, when you're taking the foreign aid, as I mentioned in my book, you're not only taking the aid, what you're doing is you're allowing them a leverage to define your reality, because the foreign donor then will have the leverage to define, construct you in its own architecture, configure you in its own reports in the way they want to present you, and also be able to define your agenda. And that is what has happened in Pakistan. So there are hard issues related to the foreign aid and the donor, which I've presented, that when we talk about so much money and billions of dollars, how much actually came, I've put that into my book. You can go into the detail in that. But the hard, apart from the hard part, the soft part, or how it changes the behavior of the nation and the public conversations and the intellectual elite, the damage is upwards of trillions of dollars. And that is the damage we are still paying right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Hussain. Very good presentation. Really like what you did. Your thesis is wonderful. Your book is great because, well, first of all, it conforms to what I think. So that's good. But the second point, let me just begin here. Are there any people from the donor agencies here? If there are, can you raise your hand so that we can at least count how many there are? Because my hypothesis is that there is nobody who even listens to the Pakistani civil society or intellectual. They only command us, they don't listen to us. So am I wrong? Please correct me if I'm wrong. So thesis verified. There is nobody from the donor agencies. So that is another thing that, Hussain, you can put in. And I'm not sure whether they attended IPRI events. I'm pretty certain they didn't. So you can tell me if they did.
Yeah, no, I've never.
Secondly, is there anybody from the civil service of Pakistan here? Any public servant here? Again, if there are, please raise your hands. No? Or did I see one hand? Okay, one Rahman Saab. Okay, great. Okay, is there anybody from the EAD here? Because EAD is concerned with aid. EAD should be, here. We've advertised this broadly. We've told everybody that we are doing it. So there's no EAD too. So this is very, very interesting, and I do it in many webinars. No civil servant shows up. Rahman Saab, thank you very much. I really appreciate your turning up. And quite frankly, if this was a donor event, all the civil services secretaries would be here too, and all the donors would be here too. They hang together. We don't hang together. We hang separately. They hang together. So that's a very important point. So let's move on. Hussain, you mentioned Ukraine and that they've got a lot of aid. But I've come to learn over the years that numbers, the headline numbers don't mean much. You have to go under the numbers. And if I remember right, Ashraf Ghani, when he was the president of Afghanistan, first when he was a finance minister, he wrote a book. And one of the early TED Talks was given by him. And if anybody has the notion, please go and see that TED Talk if you can't read the book. He wrote a book called Fixing Failed States. And in that also he mentioned that he even gave an example of how he got money to build schools. And the wood arrived. And then nothing happened. And then after a while, the wood was taken by people to burn. And that's all that happened for God knows how many $1 billion. I remember him telling me once that, that he gets only less than 10 cents on the dollar. So even in Afghanistan, do you have any figures? Is this correct what Ashraf Ghani said? Did they get the aid, the billions of dollars that's supposed to be given to them?
So my calculations of that in that Pakistan and Afghanistan has a much more problematic struggle because they had no infrastructure to even systems or institutions to put that aid. So I doubt it was even 10 cents over there. it hovered around 5 to 7 cents over there. And 10 cents is actually the figure that we quote from Pakistan. 10 cents per dollar is what we, and again, the way that 10 cents go is also very interesting because much of it is actually going into the consultancy fees as well. So we count that as well on that. So I mean, again, like I said, there is no one specific aid. The aid in terms of the infrastructure is very different. So it has a better, much better. For instance, the US aid work on transmission lines has a much better efficacy compared to, for instance, the US aid in going into the local media development or empowerment and all these issues where a lot of aid has gone. So over there, the efficacy is not even 5% of the total.
But now let's talk a little bit about the contractors. I mean, I think this is a great book to be written called The Contractors. If you can just look at the contractors for a minute. I mean, there are these firms that hang around Islamabad and you can meet them at various diplomatic parties if you get invited, which I don't. You know, there are the Chemonics and the OPMs and the ASIs and so many of them. In fact, the Beltway Bandits, that's another possible title of the book. The Beltway Bandits, there are quite a few of them. And in my sort of just browsing their websites, I see that they don't do any work other than for aid. They don't do any private sector work. They only work for aid, yet they get contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They don't get cheap contracts. Minimum contract they get is 25, 30 million pounds. What do you think about this game? And the other thing is, son, I don't think you've been in the Planning Commission, I've been in the Planning Commission. I don't think our government even knows these contractors. What do you think?
So you see, the contracting issue is a byproduct of the politics in Washington. You've lived in Washington, I've lived in Washington. The K Street is full of the lobbyists, the contractors and everything. And the whole US machinery actually works around there are two types of industry. So there are security contractors, which make quite a lot of money. Specifically, आजकल Ukraine में war चल रही है, उससे पहले अफगानिस्तान में थी. So the security contractors are well oiled up. But there is another form of contracting जो आपने बड़ी अच्छी बात की है कि एक book लिखे इस बारे में, the development contractors, which because under the benign and the noble work of the development, people continue to probably not even notice them. But there is a lot of money that flows around in the development circle. I mean, if you look at the USA data sets, there are unbelievable data that I pulled out and I've quoted in my book. Project on decentralization and there was a project on decentralization and devolution in Pakistan. In a single year, the US state spent $48 million on that. You look at the reports and you try to find information, none. There is no information except for the byline, the about of the project, that this project aids the local governments in decentralization and devolution of Pakistan. You look at the work and you realize that there is absolutely no work. What do you actually need to decentralize? What kind of money? So $48 million on that in just 1 year, by the way. Then there are projects related to this very interesting part is media development and capacity building. Another $35 million in media and capacity building. And this is, by the way, I'm not talking about, this is yearly projects. The idea of these projects in many cases is that the contractors work in cahoots with the governments in Washington. So the projects are conceived over there, the money is paid over there, the training is given over here, and those trainings are abysmal. I've been part of some of those trainings while doing my work over there in the government, and I realized that much of it was tea, biscuits, Serena hotels, and buffet dinners and lunches. So there's real training. You can't really have that sort of media and capacity building. And Wall Street, it was the Wall Street Journal or I think CS Monitor, Christian Science Monitor, Issam wrote an article in that, which was absolutely fascinating, that how the money was being paid to journalists in Pakistan, an extra stipend of about 40,000-50,000 rupees monthly, by the foreign embassies to run a particular agenda and all. And same is the case with others. So the contractors less in Islamabad, the subcontractors are in Islamabad. The real contractors are over there who are running absolutely lousy projects which shouldn't be there in the first place. And the funny part is that the same, if you look at these projects, I accidentally clicked on one of the projects. The same project that was being done in Pakistan was being done for $54 million in Cambodia as well. Same documentation, same everything. So it's like the contractors conceive, like it's kind of like McKinsey, that you have created one size fit all presentation. They're good at PowerPoints. You create a great PowerPoint, and then you just change the word Vietnam to Pakistan to India to UAE. But they really serve as PR firms instead of consulting firms in most of the cases. So again, with the contractors, it's the same thing. You create a one very nice, lovely project, and then you start selling it wherever the US aid is going. Same project everywhere without any context to local situation, M&Es. I mean, they're the waste of aid. And the US AIG Inspector General reports are very clear on it. It is unbelievable that what level of waste that there was, unprecedented, that even the US government reports suggest that we have no idea whether the aid actually even produced results. So for 20 years, you've been running projects without any idea, impact assessments, monitoring and evaluations, or even project design.
हुसैन, एक और चीज है कि ये इम्पोर्टेड गवर्नमेंट का जो नैरेटिव है, मुझे तो लगता है कि हमें आजादी मिली थी, वो बड़े क्लेवर लोग हैं, हम तो बेचारे वैसे ही पेड हैं। हमें आजादी मिली थी कौमी तराना गाने के लिए और झंडे लहराने के लिए। शुरू दिन से उन्होंने हमें एड के चक्कर में डाल के, मेरा ख्याल ये बहुत क्लेवर अप्रोच थी जो केन्स ने और डेक्स्टर वाइट ने शुरू की ब्रेटन वुड्स के बाद, कि इनको चक्कर में रखो, ये इनके ऊपर जो हम सिक्योरिटी और इनको कंट्रोल करने पे बिलियंस ऑफ डॉलर्स लगाएंगे। एक्सट्रैक्ट तो अब काफी कुछ कर लिया है, अब इनसे और एक्सट्रैक्शन के लिए ऑल वी नीड टू डू इज स्पेंड मे बी $1 billion a year and we'll have them। अगर वो हमें रखते काबू में तो हम शायद ज्यादा मार खाते। तो एक तो ये, दूसरा व्हेन आई लुक एट द कॉन्ट्रैक्टर्स, इनकी वेबसाइट से अगर कोई सर्च करे तो इट्स वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग कि most of the contractors are either ex-aid employees and they have some retired congressman on their board, and they have some retired, so it's quite a connected nexus. It's what we would call crony capitalism here, and they call us corrupt, and we accept the corruption, accusation. But they are not corrupt. They can never be corrupt. Their rules give them, as you said, one size fits all. Like there's a consulting firm called IPRI. Now it does the same thing in 30 different countries. And if it fixes something, does the same thing everywhere. And yes, that's supposed to be great work. तो ये जो मसला है, इसके तो हम इसके अंदर फंस गए हैं, because the bureaucracy is also beholden to those guys. देखिए, दो चीजें, correct me if I'm wrong, के शुरू में जब एड आई उसकी कोई यूज वैल्यू थी, बिकॉज मार्शल प्लान जैसे गया, मार्शल प्लान वेंट टू द कंट्रीज टू रीबिल्ड, दैट्स द जेनेसिस ऑफ एड। तो शुरू में जो हमारे पास भी आया, दे बिल्ड मंगला डैम, तरबेला डैम, गुड, दैट वर्कड because they were giving us the money to do something concrete. But soon the industrial overload there, the people started gaming the system. They understood the gravy train lies here. So there's tons of development practitioners who don't do nothing else but development work. And I keep telling them that probably right now, homelessness is in the US is higher than Pakistan. Why don't you do development work there? But they don't. So the development work is all done here. And they've gamed the system. They've actually captured the aid agencies, and the aid agencies now are beholden to them. For example, USAID can no longer give direct aid. It has to go through contractors. That's by law now. They have to go through contractors, and the contractors are the same people who control the business. ये हमारे साथ शुरू हो गया था, हमने किया वेबिनार गुस्ताव पापानेक के साथ, probably the aid godfather in Pakistan, who came here in the 50s, gave us the 5-year plans, etc. And Papanek also himself, I must say, was not as if a major academic था, बल्कि एक बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग बात है कि हमारे पास पापानेक आया और चिली और लैटिन अमेरिका में गए हार्बर्गर एंड फ्रीडमैन, एंड वो उनका डेवलपमेंट मॉडल हमसे बेहतर चल रहा है. सो अगेन वी कम टू द Chicago versus, other criteria. But the issue is they got better human capital. And वो किताब है बड़ी मजेदार वाल्डेस की, Pinochet's Economist, और उसमें उसने लिखा भी हुआ है कि Harberger said, I am not going to let US aid lead the business. I'm going to lead it myself. And he won the day because he was a big name. यहाँ Papanek couldn't do that. So the issue is कि हमारे पास ये सब आ गए, अब बैठे हुए, but they have developed mechanisms to control us. Have you looked into those? What is the relationship between the bureaucracy and aid? Is it, I believe they're very enmeshed. Have you looked at that relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started working on the aid part, I actually studied the whole pattern of aid and the dialogue between aid from the 1950, essentially 50 onwards till now. So वो मैंने पूरा pattern देखे, इसमें there are layers to it. So there is no one specific thing happening. It's kind of like a state of quantum where a lot of things are happening at a lot of times, and with serving interest of multiple stakeholders. So there are definitely interests of the empire. So that is there in the post-colonial language. The empire के कुछ interests हैं, and within the empire there are also like East India companies जिनके अपने interests हैं. Sometimes the East India Company becomes larger than the empire in the periphery countries. जो हमारे केस में हुआ है कि आपके यहाँ पे जो कभी कभार कॉन्ट्रैक्टर्स हैं, they were defining the agenda more than the empire itself. उनके एजेंडा से वो शिफ्ट होता रहा आपका. और उसके बाद आपका देखिए ना, empire and then the East India companies, and then you have also local nawabs. I mean, I'm giving the pre-partition example which is more interesting. So फिर आपके local नवाब भी है, local elite जो है, उनके भी अपने interest हैं which are yes, in some way they want to keep the local population under control, that they won't revolt entirely, but don't give them enough that they become comfortable and demand for more. So एक इनका भी इंटरेस्ट है, उनका भी इंटरेस्ट. ये एक लेयर्स में जो इंटरेस्ट है ना आपका, वो बहुत. और फिर हमारा यहाँ पे ये हो गया कि लोकल नवाब्स आर नॉट द ओनली वन स्टेक होल्डर्स, राइट. सो यहाँ पर आपकी फिर एक एस्टेब्लिशमेंट भी है जिसके अपने इंटरेस्ट है, जिनका टोटल एंगेजमेंट विद द यूएस इज completely, they sidestep all the traditional routes and have a very different level of engagement. So ये आपकी एक लेयर है. अब इसमें एक तो जो टेकअवेज मुझे जो नजर आए ना आपके ओवर द टाइम, one and the foremost important over there was the जो आपने बात की ना, मंगला डैम, तरबेला डैम and all of that. If you look at the conversations our people, and मैंने पुराने archives खोल के देखे हैं, the conversations our bureaucrats were having in the 1950s with the Americans was led by the civilian bureaucrats. Civilian, आपके civilian bureaucrat planning commission के बैठे हुए थे आपके. M.M. Ahmed was one of the main architects of this entire aid and block and all. आपकी foreign office और आपकी planning commission lead कर रही थी इन dialogues को. Fast forward that to over here. अब आप मुझे, I don't have to say who's going around the world and asking for aid and developing projects and all. ये आपका एक shift हो चुका है आपका. दूसरी चीज आपकी ये कि उस जमाने की जो मेंटालिटी थी, जो पब्लिक इंटेलेक्चुअल था, या जो आपकी जो कैपेसिटी थी आपकी सिविल ब्यूरोक्रेट की, वो बहुत डिफरेंट थी कंपेयर टू राइट नाउ. दैट हैज कंप्लीटली चेंज्ड. द आइडियाज हैव शिफ्टेड. तीसरी चीज, तब रॉट स्टार्ट नहीं हुई थी because there was genuine concern to develop and deliver on certain basics that we were there. And by the way, we were very successful in getting our basics right. The problem actually started in the 70s onwards when political instability and other elements started happening. That is where our development policy became securitized and part of the foreign policy. And I will credit much of that to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. I think during his tenure, much of our development policy was being shaken up in a very volatile way, triggered by his foreign policy, which was not the case initially, by the way. Initially आपको पता था western cap के अंदर है, आपकी western ethos है, western dynamics से आप चल रहे. When the shift happened in the 70s, that is where the politics started, and the foreign policy, development policy, security policy intermingled. The West Americans had issues with Bhutto Sahab, the military establishment had issues with him, and the entire tide changed. And then the 80s happened, we were part of the war. वो तो फिर आपकी खत्म होगी ना बात. आपकी जब war economy start होगी, आपकी तो development was all related to the war. 90s was the period where we were actually finding one way or the other somehow to re-engage the Americans. That was we spent the entire 90s to re-engage America. That was our strategy. There was no Soviet Union, so the bloc was not there. So we had one option, that was the Americans, and we were really, really desperate for that. 2000 onwards, again, we were part of the war. If you ask me one very specific thing, your development policies in the 70s became securitized to a point where the security interests of our local elite and the foreign elite was driving your development policies. Even अगर आप इसे look देख लें जरा break down करके एड देखें, ESF जो है आपका इकोनॉमिक सपोर्ट फंड, अगर आप उसका टेम्पोरल एनालिसिस करें तो ईएसएफ आपका इंक्रीज किया जब आप वॉर में यूएस के साथ गए, डिक्लाइन किया 90s में जब आपकी खत्म हो गई, फिर इंक्रीज किया जब आप 9/11 में गए, 9/11 के बाद अफगान वॉर लड़ी, एंड 2014 में आपके हालात खराब हुए, आपकी ईएसएफ भी नीचे आ गया। राइट नाउ एज ऑफ 2021, 2022 की डेटा नहीं है, 2021 में यू नो हाउ मच एड वी हैव रिसीव फ्रॉम द यूएस? इट इज अनबिलीवेबल, इट्स $130 million, जिसमें से बाय द वे $30 million, $130 million is the aid you have received, out of which $30 million is administrative cost. 25% has gone into the administrative cost. You can imagine that how much of the economic and development aid is actually pegged with the security interests of our local and the foreign elite, which comes back to the same questions. Yes, I blame the Western donors. Yes, I blame the contractors and all. But the real problem starts with our inability to do the right dialogue, because the people leading our conversations are not fit for a dialogue. And those that are fit for the dialogue, again, like we've had these conversations many, many times, the people who are fit for a dialogue don't are not allowed somehow, or not able to bypass the politics that you need to have a conversation. So I've run many track to dialogues with the Americans. The problem is not with them. The problem is our inability to talk anything beyond security and beyond geostrategy. I mean, we talk a lot about geoeconomics, but to this date, in 1 to 2 years, I have yet to figure out someone telling me the exact definition of what geoeconomics actually is. So
good point. बिल्कुल ठीक है. देखिए, I mean, you're absolutely right कि problem is ours, but the problem is, as I said, कि हमें तो शऊर ही नहीं, ना हमें शौक है, because as you can see, कोई हमारा public intellectual भी यहाँ नहीं आया, कोई हमारा civil servant भी नहीं आता, कोई हमारे donor के consultants भी नहीं आते. The Pakistani employees or donors are more white than the donors. They don't even want to consort with the Pakistani intellectuals because they feel somehow they'll be contaminated by the local guys. उनको हम बुलाते हैं पाइड में कि हमारे साथ आके चाय पी लें, खाना ही खा लें, वो कभी नहीं आते, वो हमसे बात भी नहीं करते. गोरे तो शायद बात भी कर लेते, वो करते ही नहीं because they feel that they are superior and they cannot consort with the natives. Anyway, let's go to the floor. Dr. Meher Zaidi. Dr. Saiba. Dr. Meher Zaidi.
Assalamualaikum जी. Thank you very much, Dr. Nadim Ulhaq. As usual, आपने बहुत ही interesting आज ये arrange की talk. अच्छा, हुसैन नदीम साहब, congratulations, आपकी इतनी आपने wider topics इसमें discuss किए जो real issues हैं हमारे, वो आपने बताए. तो मेरा बस एक ही सादा सा सवाल है कि देखिए, ये जो ट्रेनिंग ऑफ इंटेलेक्चुअल्स और ये सारी कुछ होती है, ये जाहिर है यूनिवर्सिटीज से ही होती है, स्कूल कॉलेजेस से ही होती है. मैंने तो नहीं देखा, आपने, यानी मैं 40 साल से डॉक्टर हूँ, मैंने ये नहीं देखा कि पब्लिक पॉलिसी की, जैसे प्रोफेसर माइकल है शायद येल में पढ़ाते, तो ऐसी पब्लिक पॉलिसी या पब्लिक इंटरेस्ट पे कोई लेक्चर किसी यूनिवर्सिटी के सिलेबस में शामिल हो. ये जो हमने इंटेलेक्चुअल डिस्कोर्सेस डेवलप किए, ये हमारे इसीलिए पब्लिक इंटरेस्ट में चैनलाइज नहीं हुए क्योंकि हमने कभी भी सोशल साइंसेस पे, फिर हमने ये जो हमारी क्वेश्चंस होते हैं ऑफ पब्लिक इंटरेस्ट, इस पे हमने पॉलिटिकल अपने लीडर्स बिल्ड किए, ना हमारे कोई इंटेलेक्चुअल्स बिल्ड हुए, ना कोई अंडरस्टैंड करता है. ये बात सही है कि 60s में मेरा चाइल्डहुड था, मैंने 60s के बाद पब्लिक इंटरेस्ट में, और ये बात आपकी सही है कि उस वक्त सिविल सर्वेंट्स जो थे वो एक एजेंडा के तहत काम नहीं कर रहे थे, और लेकिन उसके बाद किसी भी यूनिवर्सिटीज में हमने पब्लिक इंटरेस्ट की कोई लेक्चर्स नहीं देखे, और इस वजह से मेरे ख्याल में एक वीकनेस ये है। तो थैंक यू, आपकी किताब तो पढ़ने के काबिल है और हम जरूर पढ़ेंगे, क्योंकि हमें ऐसी किताबें चाहिए जो जिसमें आपको सही तौर पर रिसर्च वर्क मिले। थैंक यू वेरी मच।
Thank you
बहुत
so much.
शुक्रिया।
And I'll comment one thing on this part, because she's mentioned something very important, and I wrote a paper last year on this as well, which is essentially its title, Ties That Don't Bind: the gap between the academia and security establishment in Pakistan. It's a very interesting paper actually, because this is one of the causes, because I've taught at NUST, I've taught at PIDE University as well. So थोड़ा बहुत मुझे एक आइडिया, एंड आई वाज वर्किंग इन द पब्लिक सेक्टर ऑन द साइड. सो एक चीज जो ये प्रॉब्लम है ना, देखें, आपने बात की पब्लिक इंटेलेक्चुअल स्पेस यूनिवर्सिटीज में नहीं होस्ट हुई एंड ऑल. ये जो ब्रिज है ना आपका in two worlds, the policy world and the academic world, and I'll give you one example because I sit on the both sides of the aisle, and Dr. Nadimul Haq is also in a very good position to talk about it. Here is a fundamental challenge. A policy maker, let's say government civil servant है आपका, DMG officer है, grade 20, 21, 19 का भी ले लें, he has a complete different power structure, and his learning is coming from experiential background. वो AC रहा है, DC रहा है, एक्सेट्रा कमिश्नर रहा है, घूमते घुमाते हुए आपका सेक्रेटरी लेवल तक पहुंचता है. An intellectual over here in Pakistan यूनिवर्सिटी से आपका स्टार्ट हुआ लेक्चरर, असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर, एसोसिएट प्रोफेसर एंड ऑल. एक उनकी जो ट्रेनिंग है ना फ्रॉम रिसर्च साइड टू दैट साइड, एक तो उसमें इतना बड़ा वाइड गैप है कि जो हमारा सिविल सर्वेंट है ना, उसको ये लगता है कि जो आपका एकेडमिक है ये डिवोर्स है फ्रॉम रियलिटी, इसको पता ही नहीं है, सो मैं इससे मशवरा क्या लूं. पहली चीज ये. टू अ सर्टेन एक्सटेंट यस नो वी कैन आर्ग्यू ऑन दैट, हर एकेडमिक भी एक जैसा नहीं है, रिसर्च भी डिफरेंट है, कई कॉपी पेस्ट कर रहे हैं, कई बहुत अच्छी रिसर्च कर रहे हैं, बट देयर इज अ बिगर प्रॉब्लम एसोसिएटेड टू दैट. आपका पॉलिसी मेकर कभी आपके एकेडमिक को रिस्पेक्ट कर ही नहीं सकता पाकिस्तान में, और उसका रीजन है, एंड आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट द पब्लिक सेक्टर एज वेल, एंड आई विल गिव यू द एग्जांपल व्हाई पब्लिक सेक्टर एंड प्राइवेट सेक्टर इज डिफरेंट. उसकी वजह ये है कि आपका पब्लिक सेक्टर जो एकेडमिया है वो ग्रेड सिस्टम पे चल रहा है, ग्रेड 17, ग्रेड 18, ग्रेड 19. पब्लिक सेक्टर यूनिवर्सिटीज आर मोर ब्यूरोक्रेटिक and more government minded than actually the government itself, and I say that by staying on both sides of the aisle. जब आपकी ग्रेडिंग हो रही होती है ना, ग्रेड में आप एकेडमिक या पब्लिक इंटेलेक्चुअल को ले आए ग्रेड 17, 18, एक एकेडमिक की वर्थ जो है उसके ग्रेड के ऊपर नहीं होती, ना उसके रैंक के ऊपर होती है, उसकी होती है बेस्ड ऑन द डेटा, बेस्ड ऑन द रिसर्च, बेस्ड ऑन द आइडिया दैट इट प्रोड्यूस. हमने जब एक एकेडमिक को ग्रेड सिस्टम के अंदर फिक्स कर दिया और साथ उसको मीटिंग में बिठा दिया आपके गवर्नमेंट के अंदर. अब गवर्नमेंट के प्रोटोकॉल्स क्या है, सेक्रेटरी साहब बीच में बैठ रहे हैं, टेबल्स लगती हैं और साथ नेम प्लेट्स लगती हैं बेस्ड ऑन योर रैंक. अब वो रैंक में जब प्लेट्स लगती हैं, तो जब किसी जगह प्राइम मिनिस्टर के साथ मीटिंग होती है, तो मुझे याद है पहले आपका बैठते मिनिस्टर, फिर बैठते सेक्रेटरी, वो दूर करके कहीं स्टेनोग्राफर के बाद, वो पावर पॉइंट चलाने वाले के बाद एकेडमिक को बिठाते हैं. क्यों? क्योंकि आपने एकेडमिक को ग्रेड में डाल दिया. And here is where one interesting example I will give you to tell you this. One of my friend who's a very prominent journalist in Pakistan, उससे मुझे एक बड़ी अच्छी बात बताई, very intellectual journalist. He said something very important which will probably help us realize the discrepancy between public sector and academia and the journal, how the public sector thinks about other people. वो ये थी, कहते यार 2002 में जो है ना, जब ये मुशर्रफ की लिबरलाइजेशन नहीं हुई थी मीडिया की, कहता है आई वाज ऑन अ मोटर बाइक, स्कूटर पे मैं घूमता फिरता था, मैं रिपोर्टर था, बीट रिपोर्टर टाइप था, तो ये मेरी लेवल था. कहता है उस वक्त मुझे कोई सिपाही भी मिल जाता था ना, तो मैं उससे भी ऑर्डर ले लेता था, चीजें मेरा हो जाती थी, और पावर जो है वो तब सारी पॉलिटिशियंस के पास या ऑफिशियल्स के पास होती थी. कहते जब मीडिया लिबरलाइज हो गया ना 2006-7 के अंदर, जो है हमारे हालात बेहतर हो गए. मैं आ गया करोला के ऊपर, सिविक के ऊपर आ गया, तो थोड़ा जरा हमें रिस्पेक्ट मिलना शुरू हुआ कि हमें कर्नल रैंक के ऊपर ग्रेड 19-20 वाले हमें पूछना शुरू हो गए. कहते 2010-11 में जरा थोड़ा और चीजें खुली, तो कहते मैं आ गया आपकी लैंड क्रूजर के ऊपर. कहते 10 साल पहले ही होता था, 2000 कितने बता रहे कि 2002 में स्कूटर पे आता था तो मुझे सिपाही नहीं पूछता था. कहते आज मैं लैंड क्रूजर V8 से आता हूँ, और जो आपका गवर्नमेंट ब्यूरोक्रेट है वो आपका करोला से उतरता है, जो आपके ऑफिशियल्स हैं वो आपकी मर्सिडीज से उतरते हैं, मैं भी V8 से उतरता हूँ। तो उसका बेसिकली पॉइंट ये था दैट the money in the industry was the way how the journalists became power holders in an otherwise place जहाँ पे journalist की कोई औकात नहीं थी. Now coming to the same point, back to academia, आपने एकेडमिक पे स्केल्स जो हैं जहाँ रखे हुए हैं एंड जो आपके ग्रेडिंग सिस्टम में आपने डाला हुआ है, पॉलिसी मेकर तो आपको रिस्पेक्ट कर ही नहीं सकता, वो तो आपको देख के कहेगा कि यार एक तो इसको कुछ पता भी नहीं है और दूसरा इसका स्टेटस ही नहीं मैच कर रहा. यही प्रॉब्लम आपकी आ जाती है. व्हाई पॉलिसी मेकर्स नाउ, एंड आई डोंट वांट टू डिसरिस्पेक्ट एनीवन बट दिस इज समथिंग दैट ऑफ माय पर्सनल एक्सपीरियंस, बट जब आपका लम्स का प्रोफेसर आ रहा होगा जिसकी तनख्वाह ज्यादा है, जिसकी स्टेटस जरा ज्यादा है, प्राइवेट सेक्टर में ग्रेड में नहीं आया, they are more ready to listen to the lumps professor than to a professor from Qaid-e-Azam University. Why is that the case? It's because Qaid-e-Azam University public sector के अंदर रैंकिंग सिस्टम में, ग्रेड सिस्टम में आया हुआ है. उनको पता है कि यार इनकी क्या है, ये हमसे पैसे ले रहे हैं, हम क्यों इनकी सुने कोई बात. लम्स वाले जो है वो अपना इंडिपेंडेंट कर रहे हैं, उनकी तनख्वाहें डिफरेंट है, उनको वर्ल्ड बैंक से भी कॉन्ट्रैक्ट मिले हुए चाहिए, वो रजे हुए आपके आ रहे हैं, तो उनका एक सिचुएशन डिफरेंट है. ये जो निट ग्रिड्स है ना हमारे सिस्टम के अंदर, ये होनी नहीं चाहिए, बट अनफॉर्चुनेटली बिकॉज our policy system is less to do with the quality of ideas and more to do with who's the person, उसकी शक्ल कैसी है, तो उसके पीछे डिग्री क्या है, वो क्या निकाल रहा है आपका. यहाँ पर हमारे पास बड़े केसेस हुए हैं कि आपकी जाली डिग्रीज वाले जिन्होंने ऑक्सफोर्ड कैम्ब्रिज की जाली डिग्रियां बना के मीटिंग्स में बैठते रहे हैं. इन फ्रंट ऑफ मी ये केस हुआ आपका, 6 महीने आपका जाली डिग्री के साथ वो बैठ के दुनिया जहान के उसने आइडियाज दिए एंड ही वाज बीइंग क्लैप्ड ओवर. Turns out he had fake degrees, but because he was able to sell his fake degrees, any day he was above anyone who had the local degree. So ये वाली तो चीजें देखें, आपका जो local bias है वो against है कि we don't want to work on the quality of the idea. Instead we want to gauge कि अच्छा यार इसके पहले देख लो डिग्री क्या है. Sure, degree is a great thing. It tells you a lot about person's competence and all of that. But at the same time, it's also the level of idea that also is important.
Shahid Mahmood. Shahid Mahmood.
Ji, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Hussain. This is Shahid Mahmood, the research fellow at PIDE, and thank you for the interesting presentation. This is something I'm also working upon. थोड़ा बहुत मैंने भी इस पे काम किया है. We are at PIDE are working on that. कुछ एक मेरा comment है और कुछ छोटे-छोटे just brief कुछ questions है. Comment मेरा ये है, अभी जो आप बात कर रहे थे ना कि वो जो जितने भी researchers हैं वो being in public sector उनको वो नहीं मिलती. Yes, that is one aspect of it. Another aspect of this is कि जो उनकी सिविलियन ब्यूरोक्रेसी या मिलिट्री एस्टैब्लिशमेंट है, उनकी जो उन्होंने ग्रेवी ट्रेन इस पे चलती है ना फॉरेन एड पे, तो they don't want it to be disturbed by anybody. That is another aspect of it. Whether you agree or disagree, वो मतलब वो अलग बात है. But this is one of my observations कि उन they have this thing कि यार अच्छा फॉरेन एड आ रही है, वो इसको इस तरह नहीं देखते. वो ये नहीं देखते कि किस प्रोजेक्ट के लिए आ रही है, किस काम के लिए आ रही है. वो ये देखते हैं कि उसमें उनकी कितनी सीटें बनेंगी, प्रोजेक्ट पोस्ट क्रिएट होंगी और कितने पैसे मिलेंगे. जो आप अक्रॉस द सिविलियन या मिलिट्री एस्टैब्लिशमेंट दोनों लोग कहते हैं डिवाइड, इस काम में बिल्कुल उनकी एक ही नजरिया है, एक ही तरीके से इस चीज को देखते हैं. एंड दैट इज द देयर बेसिक स्टार्टिंग पॉइंट. अच्छा, कुछ मेरे छोटे सवाल हैं, ब्रीफ क्वेश्चंस हैं. एक तो ये है कि जी ये जो डिमांड फॉर फॉरेन एड या उनकी फॉरेन एक्सपर्टीज की वो आगे हमें मशवरे दें, तो ये ज्यादातर किससे आती है इन योर एक्सपीरियंस? ये मिलिट्री एस्टैब्लिशमेंट है, सिविलियन ब्यूरोक्रेसी है, वेयर डज इट कम फ्रॉम, मतलब ज्यादातर कहाँ से? दूसरी बात, ड्यूरिंग माय वर्क वन ऑफ द थिंग्स दैट व्हेन आई मेट डिफरेंट पीपल, तो वन ऑफ द थिंग्स दैट दे मेंशन्ड वाज कि जी देयर इज नॉर्मली तो हम डिफेड वगैरह, यूएसएड वगैरह, एंड दे हैव बीन प्रीटी इन्फ्लुएंशियल, यस, लेकिन दे आर कुछ लोग, बहुत से लोग ऐसे भी थे जिन्होंने कहा कि यार देयर इज अ न्यू प्लेयर इन द टाउन एंड वेरी इन्फ्लुएंशियल, एंड दैट इज दोज आर द चाइनीज. कि आप उन पे भी जरा वो करें कि उनका इन्फ्लुएंस कितना है. सो हाउ डू यू कंपेयर दीज टू, द वेस्टर्न, सो कॉल्ड वेस्टर्न डोनर्स, मिसाल के तौर पे डिफेड, यूएसएड वगैरह या हो गए, कंपेयर टू चाइनीज, उनके क्या, how do you compare them, their standard operating procedures, are they different or same? Third, एक सवाल ये है कि my own experience, even before I started this research was कि ये जो contractors होते हैं ना, कुछ ये जो बड़े-बड़े ये donors होते हैं, इनके बड़े favorite contractors होते हैं. And my own impression is, and you might disagree with this, कि ये कुछ predetermined winners होते हैं already. जब ये contract निकालते हैं, उसमें already इन्होंने कुछ ना कुछ decision दिया होता है कि who would be winning this contract and who to give this contract, right? And last but not least, it's a comment and a question type too. कि for example, in my research on USAID, and you've been doing this too, इसमें सिर्फ जो domestic level के contractors होते हैं, सिर्फ इधर नहीं होते, बाहर वहाँ पे US में भी जो है मैंने देखा है उनके I've compiled a list कि उनके अच्छे खासे contractors हैं. And it turns out कि जब Republicans की government होती है तो उनके अपने जो think tanks होते हैं वो उनको ठेके देते हैं, they bring them in. और जो Democrats होते हैं जब उनकी government होती है तो वो भी जो है इस तरह अपने वो think tanks और उनको favor करते हैं. So who मतलब if is it domestic versus foreign contractors, in if you take a view of it, in your view, कौन है जो ज़्यादा benefit करता है इस foreign aid के influence? Thank you.
Thank you. Acha, so I'm going to start with your first question, which was कि aid मांगी कहाँ से जाती है? देखिए, military aid तो obviously security aid तो आपकी military establishment से आती है, वो तो it's a given. जो economic aid है आपकी वो supposedly civilian side से आपकी आती है, but again there are Dr. Nadim Ulagh is probably more aware of this thing, but जो आपकी इस्लामाबाद की environment है ना, हमारी political वहाँ पे कुछ players हैं तो जो players हैं ना कुछ they continue to move from one political party to the other to the third. They are constant in the system.
ये तो चीजें होती हैं
तो आपके ये
डिफरेंट चीज मंगवाए ना बार-बार बोल के
आपका वो म्यूट कर दें आप अपना.
ये सब
Sir, Dr. Sir,
my mistake. Sorry.
तो आपके जो कुछ हमारे लोकल में जो है ना कुछ टेक्नोक्रेट्स जिनको हम कहेंगे, they continue to move from one government to the other. वो permanent आपके हैं यहाँ पे जो who knows the system, who knows the aid and who are very well connected in DC. जो I mean we know the names and the names. I don't have to say any name. But the aid is essentially any new government is not interested and does not have the capacity to actually do the whole rut all over again. So they deploy the same people who will help them to get the economic aid. So ये आपके दो तरीके हैं. जो दूसरा आपका question था वो था related to the, I believe it was related to Chinese and जो local हमारे जो बाकी foreign western is like second one होता था या third था वो वाला? Yeah, so I'll just answer the second one. Okay, here is an interesting part about this thing that I work very close with the Chinese as well. Very dear friends, very good people, but they have a very different way of operating. We have to understand one thing. China is a new power block. China has never been used to this foreign aid, foreign development. It is only 10-15 years. आज से 10-15 साल पहले चाइना ने थोड़ा अपना outward looking होना start किया, where they're going around the world and all, and more so in the last 7 years. उसका net result basically ये हो रहा है कि they're learning. You see, to be an empire, you just don't become an empire overnight. You learn the art of the governing. And by the way, the British, if you talk to any British civil servant, they say that the Americans don't know how to run a global empire because they're not used to it and they're very still new at this game. More or less since after the end of the Cold War, they've been trying to do that. And वो भी अमेरिका में इतनी friction रही है कि large chunk of the Americans want America to be inward looking. The Democrats want America to be outward looking. So even America is learning and tiptoeing around with how to do the international development and international engagement. I mean, America तो छोड़ दें, अब Chinese की जब बात करते हैं तो Chinese right now, I personally believe, do not understand the foreign development aid, do not understand the foreign projects, how they're done. For instance, in Africa, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, which is one of the reasons why if you look at how much trouble Chinese are facing right now, it's not because Chinese somehow are bad at their work. It's just that this is a new domain for them, the international development and the donor work, and Chinese operate donor work in a very different way. उनके large scale infrastructure projects हैं जो उनकी वहां पे सेंट्रलाइज्ड होती हैं, उनकी चाइना कंस्ट्रक्शन को मिल गया, चाइना इलेक्ट्रिक को मिल गया और वहां से आपका डिप्लॉय हो गया विद इन डेज. In a country like Pakistan, when they come across, for instance, 34 or 54 NOCs, Chinese को समझ ही नहीं आती उस चीज की कि ये what is happening. And when they run into the federal and the local devolution, and when they run into the different issues related to power structures in Pakistan, and a few years later a government toppling over, so Chinese are finding it very hard to understand the local contexts. Chinese are very good with dealing because they don't want to get into the nitty-gritties. Americans love to get into the nitty-gritties of Pakistani political space, and all Chinese have not done that. And the best in that is the British, which is why if you ask me ballpark figures, look at the DFID, US aid, and CPEC. In terms of the efficacy of the projects and the way the projects have been managed, I would rate DFID right up here, because DFID has the right amount. उनका कभी भी कोई project billion pound का नहीं होगा. उनका project आपको होगा 50 million pound, 150 million pound to 50 million pounds, very targeted, sector specific, with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 objectives. They serve their interest and a little bit your interest. They know the local dynamics, the local politics, who's who and all. They get the project done. Americans, they love, I mean, Americans are like a big picture guy. They love the big vision, the big picture, come with a lot of money and all. 2 months later, they fizzle out and their interest is lost and they move somewhere else. And that is where the project's completely, so some money comes in, the rest of the money is wasted. Americans waste a lot. And you can just look at, and I'll to give you the explanation of that later. But third is the Chinese model. Chinese count every single penny. If the scale of the projects of the Americans are 1 million and the British are at 200,000, the Chinese will have about 500,000, but they will count every penny, and much of that money will be deployed and used in the infrastructure. So they don't believe in the soft power and the soft development and all. They're here to do business, but they're having a reality check because they understand that going around the world, the entire world is not China. They don't understand the centralized structure, so they need to develop that, and it will take them a few years or decades to actually go about doing that. But here is a very interesting point that I wanted to raise. If you want to look at the foreign development of countries or their foreign policies, just look at how their local policies and their local curriculum has developed. The British are very, very deep into the qualitative research. Much of the British universities, and I have had an exposure of studying in UK and in the US as well. In US, in the undergrad, they would teach you everything, a little bit of everything. It was broad strokes. The courses would be actually, for instance, I'll give you an example. At George Washington University, I took a course in 1.5 to 2 billion people. Politics of South Asia, broad strokes. They will teach you broad elements, broad themes and all, the big picture. Throughout the undergrad, it is a picture. Even at the grad school, master's level, it is still a very big macro level meta picture. At the PhD level that they go into the micro man. But if you look at I did my second undergrad at University of Oxford. I was there for my time. And interestingly, the same South Asia course that I took at Oxford, it was called India. Course was India from 1919 to 1929. They taught a full course of 10 years of Indian politics between 1919 to 1929, the post-World War I year. The difference is the same curriculum and the methodology. America is quant focused, very big on numbers and all. British is focused much more on the qualitative. And if you look at their policies, the British operate in the diplomatic policies through very, very specific talking to the people, interviewing as many people, developing projects in mutual coordination with the people on ground. The Americans, they develop projects in Washington, DC, come and give a presentation over it, and they deploy a project which more or less fail in Pakistan and in other parts of the world as well, unless they're infrastructure, large-scale projects. With the Chinese, they have a very unique methodology altogether. It's a very micromanaged, structured, systematic. The problem is Chinese go with the plan. In real world, the plans usually don't work out. In China, it works. In countries like Pakistan, there is one suicide bomb blast and the entire plan is toppled over, which is raising to the frustration of the Chinese. So that is to answer your second question. I think I've the 3 questions. I'm missing one question. If you can repeat that, or we can ask later.
Thank you, Hussain. Thank you very much. Okay, one last point that I'd like to raise before we close. Hussain, I don't agree with you on the DFID efficacy. I mean, look at what happened when Michael Barber came here. The education project went nowhere. Look at IGC, went nowhere. I mean, I think quite frankly, they have been captured just as much as the others. In fact, I mean, in most places, the very interesting thing also, it's not just the contractors. What is amazing is the coup that the universities have pulled. For example, LSE and Cambridge or Oxford are collaborating on this IGC, where most of the money goes to those guys and very little comes here. But nevertheless, you know, it's a project that's working. The Brits are always very good at diplomacy, so they're doing that. But Harvard, etc., also, for example, the Duflo Banerjee lab has thrived on aid. I mean, their Nobel Prize should actually be given to aid because they've got a large amount of aid now goes into randomized control experiments, and so does DFID. Everything goes into randomized control, which I don't think is leading us too much, but it has made us laboratory animals. We are lab animals. They do randomized control tests, and we don't even know about them. We just participate in them as lab animals. So that's one thing. But the second thing that I want to talk to you about, the second question, you keep saying that the elite is giving in, etc., but also you see that there's a volcano in this country. And you're telling me that these guys are just so short-sighted, they can't see the volcano, and they're just sitting here trying to, I mean, that kind of a short-sighted elite model, you and I have argued about it often. I put it on Twitter too. I think that's a bit of a short-sighted model. So I'd like you to comment on that. The third thing I'd like to say is, a very important point. A long time ago, I did this paper with Ali Khan and with Jahangir Aziz, two papers that I talked about the technical assistance. We looked at it in very detail and proved that technical assistance, no matter what you do, is always going to be inferior to reversing the brain drain. So we have a model where we have increased the brain drain, and I've done a lot of work on this. Pakistan is a country that is a net supplier of brains to the world. You yourself are going to now leave the country. In fact, my advice to all the young people is leave the country because there's no room for brains here. So quite frankly, we are a talent-repellent country and we ask people to leave the talent. But by definition, and this is mathematically easy to show, and we've done that, that by definition, the cheaper talent would come here. The US or whatever these agencies, they don't send their best people here. In fact, they're less than average people come on technical assistance. Our best people go overseas. So if you think of a talent trade, we are a net supplier of talent, and we are a net, quality-wise, we lose out on the talent gain. And the fourth thing is that the dumping argument. Our universities, we've got 236 universities, and as you said, that nobody demands any research from them, neither the government or the private sector. They're just sitting there producing bozos, and we lose out in a big way. But why should anybody demand anything from them when the donors come along and supply every little aid? You're short of toilet paper, donors will do a project in toilet paper. And donors can say whatever they like. For example, I was surprised that the UN put out a report saying all kinds of things about not one report, 2 or 3 reports. In fact, Mark Andre, the UN guy, actually wrote an op-ed, which was very strange. And the World Bank wrote a report criticizing the army, criticizing the security establishment. Yet we don't see anything. So I'd like you to comment on these things. One, is our elite short-sighted? And if it's short-sighted, it's such a stupid elite. And I don't expect, I really think, yeah, because we're also stupid. All of us are stupid. So we deserve, whoever you say stupid, we are. And then, of course, we lose on the talent side. And fourth thing is that dumping takes place. And finally, capacity building also has hurt us. We had better capacity before they started building capacity. I mean, honestly, I have seen that we are losing people. We are losing brains, and we are getting capacity built every day. New projects and capacity building. So just comment on those, then we'll close.
Okay, I'll start with the, I'm glad you asked these couple of very important questions. I'll start with the political ruling elite, which I talk a lot about, personal conversations as well, and sometimes the social media. Now I don't talk much about social media because I don't think Twitter is a place for discussion anymore. The question about short-sightedness, I don't think people who have won local elections, people who have been coming in governments over and over again, who have the ability to rig the system, to essentially also rig the international system, play onto the vulnerabilities of the Americans, fool them in many cases, are short-sighted. If you look at the personal businesses in the wealth, they're going like this. The natural exchequer is going like this. The reason why that is there, and me and you have had a lot of conversations on this, is because the system of governance that they've deployed is not an intellectually well thought out system. They deployed a system which they saw under the colonial empire, under the British Empire. The problem was that the British Empire, their system, for instance, their policing, their rule of law, their economic policies, they were there to support the empire from the periphery countries, which were India, Pakistan, and the part of the British Raj. We, instead of decolonizing, like initially you said, we had the independence, we really got the country. We did not have the independence because we did not decolonize. And Americans, if you look at the 1776 and the later American history, Americans did one thing very good. They not only got a country, but they truly decolonized themselves because they had some of the best, in my opinion, thinkers who had the ability to do the intellectual decolonization, which we did not. Americans developed their own systems. I don't know how many of you know over here, but the first elections in the United States, right after the independence, was not an election, to be very honest. It was the entire country bandwagoning around George Washington, begging him to become the president. Because after the war ended with the Revolutionary War, President George Washington decided, he laid down his arms and he went into a retirement in his home in Mount Vernon in Washington. He left for that. The entire country gathered, had protests, mobilized to get him to be the president. So when he became the leader in the Constitution, who was the person who wrote it down that the term of the president will be twice, and there will be 4 years term, twice president and president. I think it was 3 times before. President of the US, the term itself. He had the option because the people of the United States were happy to develop a kingship, declare him as a king. It never happened. He declared himself the president, gave himself, I think, a 3 tenure or second year. So these things are different in terms of intellectual decolonization. In our case, the ruling elite actually did the exact opposite. It took the exact same model of the British Empire, replaced the British Raj with themselves, the civil bureaucracy, the military establishment, and the feudal political elite, and then ran the population that was there. They did not really had the credibility or legitimacy from the population. For last 70 years, if you look closely, what has happened is that the ruling elite of this country, this troika, the civil bureaucracy, the military establishment, and the feudal political elite, this is the troika that came after the British Empire. These are the 3 lots that took over. These 3 have been struggling with one thing, and that is legitimacy from the people. And the elections have been rigged, the military coups have been there, part and parcel, because the infight amongst them was there, but it was really the lack of legitimacy from the people which was growing the politics. So what I'm really essentially talking about is not the short-sightedness. Our elite is very long-sighted. The only problem is that they did not have the intellectual, either the time or the need, or they did not bother. My personal opinion is it was by design. They saw a functioning British Empire's model, and then they realized that, great, the independence was really by the elite. Your elite got the independence. I don't think the people got the independence because they were replaced by one British ruler from the local rulers. The problem is, under the local leadership, the public sector education collapsed. Under the local leadership, the health system collapsed. The justice system collapsed to a place right now, which is a boiling plate. So for the ruling elite, I think they have for a very, very long time played on the vulnerabilities of the people. They thrive on the vulnerabilities of the people. Development is not a rocket science. It is not a nuclear science. And if it was a nuclear science, we would have done that. If the same ruling elite can develop a nuclear weapon, how hard it is to develop an infrastructure for education and infrastructure for medical. This is, I think that again shows you the level of priorities and how deeply politicized our development process was. And by the way, the subject of my next book is the politics of underdevelopment. And much of what I look at in that book is how underdevelopment has been kept by design for the purpose, because it allows elite to run its politics over the people and also internationally. So that's to answer your question on the elite part. And I'm very critical of the ruling elite and their policies for the last 70 years. And I don't think that the current setup or any setup in this country can really go on without the elite undergoing decolonization, if we have to say. I think your other question was related to the I believe it was related to the aid or something. I'm not sure about that.
The talent trade.
The talent. Again, I'm not an expert on the talent trade part. I do think there is one caveat to entire thing. I think this subject needs a revisit, partly because the future of talent is not based on geography alone. The future of talent is based on the digitalized world. So we're living in two parallel worlds at the moment, whether we like to agree or not. One is the physical world where we are present here. The other is the digital world. The moment you step into the digital world, you're no more from Pakistan. Your IP address, which can be again VPN लगा के आप वो भी change करते हैं, आप digital world में हो. जो digital world है ना, सर उसकी labor force change हो गई है. The meta world, the digital world, the crypto world, the finance world, the digital finance world, that has changed. उसकी labor force भी change हो गई है. What I predict, what I foresee is that the future of the world, which already has started, it's less to do with your nationality, your physical presence, your religious belief. It's much more to do with your specific skill set. So these little world, the digital world that we're talking about, it is becoming mini universes. The meta universe, soon there will be a universe of Twitter, then Amazon universe, the Google universe and all of them require a different talent sets. So you will be recognized really by what universe do you belong, less by your nationality, more by your association with what type. If you know the Python coding, okay, you go into Google. If you've learned the R programming, okay, fine, you may be going to Twitter, etc., etc., etc. So I do think that the future of the world will look like based on the digitalization and based on the skill set. What our concern is, and I've said this, the last project I'm doing for the IPRI was Web 3.0 initiative. And my goal was with that project, and if I was in the policy community, I would train not based on the skill set of right now, but on the skill set of the 10, 15 years down the line. We need more visual artists. We need more digital content creators. We need more 2D, 3D animators. We need more content creators. We need more people who understand the coding languages, the Pythons and all of that, because that will form the labor force for the digital. And it does not matter whether you geography, because आपकी वो outsource होनी है यहाँ पे. और वो आउटसोर्स भी इसी तरह से नहीं होनी टिपिकल सेंस में कि आपने कॉल सेंटर यहाँ पे, you will be insourcing into the digital world. So you have a pool. For instance, I'll give you one example. Fast University है Islamabad में, they're producing one of the excellent most data scientists and computer scientists. Much of their batch gets right now, उनको 5, 6, 7 लाख रुपए की तनख्वाहें मिल रही हैं आपकी कैनेडियन कंपनीज में और इधर उधर, sitting in Pakistan. They don't even want to move abroad. अगर उनको वो companies कह भी देती है ना कि आप आ जाएं वहां पे, they don't want to go because what they earn over here in terms of the dollars and the level of money that they have to pay for that, it's different. So अगर आप San Francisco move करते हैं, the same amount you will be saving about what, 5%. Over here they're saving 95% based on the. So we need to think more digitally when we talk about the trade of workforce. We need to look at where the future of labor is going. वो हमारे सामने है, उसमें कोई rocket science नहीं है. We know technical parts में किन 6-7 industries में आपने वहां पे universities के अंदर 100 million का budget डालें, focus more on preparing AI people, ML people, focus more on preparing coding languages, etc., etc. आपकी 50-60 thousand की साल की workforce निकल रही है. then you basically have to just sit. You don't even have to bother. आपके पास खुद ही companies आएंगी, offices set up करेंगी, digital force में आपकी वो चले जाएगी. So we need to think a little bit more beyond जो हम लोग अभी भी वो सोचते हैं ना, जब लेबर के बारे में हम सोचते हैं कि दुबई जो भेजनी है लेबर, या हमने जो अमेरिका में डॉक्टर्स भेजने हैं या उससे बाहर नहीं निकले. Digital workforce requires a very digitalized mindset, and I think it's much easier to do that. But if your finance minister says कि मुझे तो पता ही नहीं Web 3.0 है क्या, and there are his whole fan is following is saying that look how honest he is, that he does not know and he's claiming it. In a world where we are right now, if your finance ministers, your prime ministers, your ministers are not aware of Web 3, or they're not aware of Web 4, or they're not aware of the technology, they should retire and sit at home, because the future is technology. By the time aap abhi 2G pe ja rahe hain, the world has already gone to 5G. So Pakistan's future in the workforce, in the labor market, is that we need to move from analog directly to 5G. अगर हम एनालॉग से 2G से 3G जा रहे हैं और उसके ऊपर इलेक्शन,
but I'm sorry, ये I think जरा थोड़ा simplistic है, क्योंकि quite frankly हमने फिर भी global value chain में वर्कर ही रहना है. In the digital world also, in your vision, we will remain the coolies. We will not develop the Googles and the Facebooks, etc., etc. I think, quite frankly, the digital world is concentrating wealth more. It is creating global ownership. For example, digital Apple is larger than most countries now. So Apple has got a huge amount of talent. And I think that even before, to accentuate over here, the talent game is accentuated. So if we keep losing talent, I think there's a problem. In any case, we'll continue that. Talk about dumping and capacity building. What do you think about that? Those two.
So the capacity building is supposed to happen locally and organically. ये ऐसे नहीं हो सकता कि आपका कॉन्ट्रैक्ट मिल गया, किसी फर्म को मिल गया, उन्होंने आपकी आके कैपेसिटी बिल्डिंग कर दी. I've seen way too many capacity building projects गवर्नमेंट के किए गए, again worth millions of dollars. You've tried to develop capacity of the local governments and etc. We all know where those projects go, what the net result of those projects are. I don't personally think you require capacity building in the traditional sense, led by the foreign. आपने कैपेसिटी बिल्डिंग करनी है, आप लोकल जो अपने इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं, जो आपकी फॉर इंस्टेंस ट्रेनिंग इंस्टीट्यूशंस बने गवर्नमेंट के हैं, लोअर कैडर की आपकी कैपेसिटी है ही नहीं यहाँ पे, ग्रेड 6-17 एंड अंडर की आपकी कैपेसिटी बिल्डिंग ना होने के बराबर है. उनके ट्रेनिंग्स अगर आपने करने, वो आपको लोकल खुद ही करने पड़ेंगे. अगर आपने इनहैंस करना है, करिकुलम इनहैंस करना है इसका निप्स का या बाकी इंस्टीट्यूशंस का, सो वो आपको खुद करना पड़ेगा. I don't personally think capacity building can be a foreign-led project जिसकी बेसिस के ऊपर आपका आ जाएगा. It's a rather easy thing to say. जहां तक बात है आपकी टेक्निकल असिस्टेंस की, वो तो शॉर्ट टर्म आपकी शॉर्ट टर्म फिक्स है फॉर अ पर्टिकुलर प्रोजेक्ट. It has no long-term value, but the damage it does is actually a long-term. Because under the notion of capacity building and technical assistance, what really is happening is that your people who are supposed to do that are saying कि यार ये हमारा काम ही नहीं है, तो डोनर का काम है. And this is something that happens in the government a lot. कि जो काम आपका है वो आपने डाल दिए डोनर के, होता है कि यार नहीं वो डोनर तो कर रहे हैं, वो कर रहे हैं, तो हम कुछ और कर लेते हैं. So I do think that the foreign aid and the donor projects, including the TA and the capacity building projects, what they do is that they shift the ownership and onus of burden from the people that are supposed to do it to people that are there for short term only, consultants. So वो जब आपका होगा तो उसका नेट रिजल्ट कभी भी आपका अच्छा हो ही नहीं सकता है. डंपिंग की आपने बात की, I'm assuming you're talking about the studies that are being done. I mean, again, I've said this before, I'll say it again, कि there is no shortage of studies in the country. There are studies after studies after studies on our issues. This much of those are essentially very elite in nature in terms of their orientation. Donor-led theories, donor-led languages, donor-led contexts, very much divorced from the local realities, local ground. Reports that are there just because the funding was there, you had to spend the funding. वो फंडिंग को स्पेंड करने के चक्कर में आपने यूजलेस किस्म की स्टडीज करा ली, जो प्लानिंग कमीशन में अभी भी चलती आ रही है पिछले 30-40 साल से. Do we need more knowledge production? I don't know. Do we need more knowledge implementation? Absolutely. Donors को आप किसी दिन कहीं ना कि जरा आप प्रोजेक्ट इम्प्लीमेंटेशन में आए, आपके डोनर सारे भाग जाएंगे, because that is the place where they don't want to get involved in, because they understand that when it comes to project implementation, it is extremely easy to design a project at the donor stage. You conceive a project, you design a project, आपने steps भी बता दिए, implementation plan भी बता दिया. Problem is कि वही plan आप वियतनाम में भी apply कर रहे हो. The moment you get on the ground to develop the implementation, to do the implementation, आपको realize होता है कि there is a problem because the project design and implementation are so divorced from realities, because the people designing the projects are not the ones who are implementing, which is why much of the projects that come for implementation, people are wondering कि यार ये project तो ऐसे हो ही नहीं सकता आपका. Net result is that you have projects that are just sitting there doing nothing at all. And a lot of these projects are just big ticket items जिसके अंदर आपकी all sorts of irrelevant actually जो overhead costs हैं वो आ जाती हैं, जो काम actually करने वाला है वो उसके अंदर आता नहीं है. I mean, I'm not to say that entire donor agency and they've never done anything. There are projects that are worth commending, infrastructure के अंदर mostly. ये जो soft development के आपके हैं, ये आप donor से ना expect कर सकते हैं, ना वो आपके लिए कर सकते हैं, जो करना भी नहीं चाहिए.
Thank you, Hussain. Great discussion. Wonderful. Lots of stuff to chew over. I don't agree with you, obviously, on many things. We know that. But I don't agree with you that we don't need more research. In fact, I think we need a lot of research, because all the research that donors have done is repeating themselves, as well as kind of superfluous. For example, we still don't have any research on the energy sector where we lose so much money. We're just producing probably the first book on the sector, probably in the country. We've got some stray reports, but nothing that ties everything together. I think, quite frankly, the government should have put in an energy commission. I tried to do that in the planning commission. I couldn't. The energy commission should have produced a white paper that we should have gone on. Right now, we don't know anything. We just keep mumbling, things. For example, we have nothing really. We've got tons of reports on the civil service, but nothing done at the intellectual level by us people. For example, judiciary. Yeah, we've got the ADB project, but we've got no local research on the judiciary. I can name so many subjects that need to be thought through. And I think we need a lot of research and implementation this has become a mantra here that we should implement whatever is available. But I think we've tried that. We've implemented so many things. We've implemented the IPPs. Look where we are. We've implemented privatization. Look where we are. We've implemented the NDMAs. Look where we are. So quite frankly, we've implemented a lot of things. I don't think we give ourselves credit for what we've implemented. But the issue is really that we implement things. We are trying to do something on the fund program. We have done 23 fund programs. Where are we? I think the key lesson to learn, and you put it in your book and you say it very well, ultimately it's all about growing up. And we are a country that refuses to grow up. I don't know whether anybody's read Tin Drum or not. Tin Drum is a book about Germany, won the Nobel Prize. Günter Grass wrote it. It's all about Germany not growing up and eventually trying to, start wars, etc. So I think we are a country that refuses to grow up and refuses to accept our own responsibility. And there are many reasons why it is, but quite frankly, I can't put a finger on it, what causes it. But thank you. All we can do is create a discussion like this, and we hope that more and more people will join. The biggest problem that I see in my mind is we cannot create a conversation in our country. By we, I mean the liberal side of Pakistan. The mullah side of Pakistan has created a conversation and they're winning. I wrote about that a long time ago, that the mullahs are winning. Why? Because they create a conversation. We can't. We can't sustain a conversation. We can't create a conversation because, quite frankly, many of us can't even sit at the same table. So there it is. Let's keep talking, see what happens. Hussain, thank you very much. Congratulations on your move to California, on to better climes. Keep in touch. Keep giving us news from there. Make us understand the global digital world. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.